What happens when a CEO bans all meat from the workplace and her team responds by building a secret barbecue operation in the basement? Let me show you. Be me, 32. Name is Roderick and I work as a senior marketing coordinator at Catalyst Creative, a mid-sized creative agency where I've spent the last 5 years helping brands tell their stories while working alongside some of the most talented and interesting people I've ever known. This story is probably the strangest workplace experience I've ever had, and I've had some unusual ones, but it's also one that taught me something important about community, shared experiences, and what happens when people feel pushed too far by rules that don't make sense to them. What started as a simple policy change turned into something none of us could have predicted, and looking back on it now, I'm still amazed at what we built together in those few months before everything came to light. Let me tell you about Catalyst Creative and what it was like to work there before everything changed, because understanding the culture helps explain why the events that followed unfolded the way they did. We were a creative agency of about 90 people, handling marketing, branding, and design work for clients ranging from local startups to national brands, and the culture had always been relaxed and focused on results rather than rigid rules. The previous leadership understood that creative people do their best work when they're given freedom and trust, so the office had always been a place where individuality was celebrated and people were treated like adults who could make their own decisions. The kitchen and break room had always been a central gathering place where people from different departments would connect over lunch, share meals they'd brought from home, and build the kind of informal relationships that made collaboration easier. Food was actually a big part of our culture, with team lunches, birthday celebrations, and the occasional Friday afternoon cookout in the parking lot during nice weather, bringing people together in ways that pure work interactions never could. I have some of my best memories from those gatherings, conversations that started over shared meals and turned into friendships, creative ideas that emerged from casual lunch discussions, the sense of community that came from breaking bread together. About a year ago, the company went through a transition when our founder retired and brought in new leadership to take the agency in what he called a more progressive direction aligned with modern values and contemporary business practices. The new CEO was Waverly, a 45-year-old executive who came from a larger agency and who had strong opinions about how workplaces should operate in terms of sustainability, wellness, and what she called ethical business practices. Her first few months were focused on learning the business and making small changes that most people didn't have strong feelings about, things like updated recycling programs and more energy-efficient lighting that seemed reasonable enough. The change that would eventually lead to everything that follows was announced about 6 months into Waverly's tenure, during an all-hands meeting that I remember vividly because of how confused everyone looked by the end of it. Waverly explained that she had been thinking deeply about the agency's environmental impact and its responsibility to model ethical practices for clients and the broader business community. As part of this commitment, she announced that Catalyst Creative would be transitioning to a fully plant-based workplace, meaning that meat and animal products would no longer be permitted anywhere on company premises. The reasoning she provided was extensive, covering environmental sustainability, animal welfare, health benefits, and the importance of aligning workplace practices with progressive values that she believed represented the future of responsible business. She acknowledged that this was a significant change and that people might need time to adjust, but she expressed confidence that everyone would come to appreciate the benefits of a plant-based environment once they experienced it firsthand. The policy would take effect in 2 weeks, giving people time to adjust their habits and for the office kitchen to be restocked with approved plant-based options that she assured us would be delicious and satisfying. I sat in that meeting trying to process what I had just heard, looking around at colleagues who wore expressions ranging from confusion to barely concealed frustration, though nobody said anything openly in the moment. The thing is, I don't have anything against plant-based food. I eat vegetarian meals regularly and I understand the environmental arguments. But the idea of being told what I could and couldn't eat at my own workplace felt like an overstep that went beyond reasonable policy. It wasn't about the food itself so much as the principle that my personal dietary choices were now subject to someone else's ideological preferences, even though they had nothing to do with my job performance or professional responsibilities. The first few weeks under the new policy were an adjustment period that ranged from mildly annoying to genuinely difficult depending on who you talked to and what their relationship with food was like. The office kitchen was restocked with plant-based options that were fine but not particularly exciting, and the energy in the break room shifted as the spontaneous meal sharing that had been part of our culture became more complicated. Some people adapted easily because they were already eating mostly plant-based diets anyway, but others, particularly those who had relied on protein-heavy meals to fuel long creative sessions, found themselves struggling with energy levels and focus. Declan from IT was one of the people who struggled most visibly, a guy in his late 20s who had always been a big eater and who found the plant-based options left him hungry and unfocused during the afternoon hours when his work required the most concentration. He started taking longer lunch breaks to go off-site for meals, which was technically allowed but which ate into his productive time and required him to eat alone rather than with colleagues he had previously shared lunch with. Others did the same thing, and the lunch hour that had once been a time of community building became a time when people scattered to find food that actually satisfied them, returning to the office fed but disconnected from each other. About a month into the new policy, Declan came to me with a discovery that would change everything, though at the time it seemed like nothing more than an interesting piece of information about our office building. He had been exploring the building while troubleshooting some network issues and had found that the basement, which most people thought was just storage and mechanical equipment, actually contained a large and used space that had apparently been some kind of employee lounge decades ago. The space had been forgotten over the years as the company changed and renovated, but it still had ventilation systems, electrical hookups, and enough square footage to be genuinely useful if someone wanted to do something with it. I'm not sure which one of us first suggested what we ended up doing, but within a week of Declan's discovery, we were having serious conversations about whether it would be possible to set up some kind of secret cooking operation in the basement. The idea was absurd on its face, the kind of thing you joke about but don't actually do, except that the more we talked about it, the more we realized that we actually could do it if we were careful and committed. Sutherland from operations got involved because he had connections to restaurant supply companies and knew how to source equipment discreetly, and once he was on board, the plan started to feel less like a fantasy and more like something that might actually happen. The acquisition and installation of the smoker was an operation that required more planning and coordination than some of our actual client projects, which says something about how motivated we were to make this work. Sutherland found a commercial-grade smoker that was being sold by a restaurant that had closed, and we arranged to have it delivered late one evening, when the building would be mostly empty and the loading dock could be accessed without attracting attention. Moving it into the basement required 6 people, a furniture dolly, and about 2 hours of careful maneuvering through service corridors that most employees didn't even know existed, but by midnight we had it installed and connected to the ventilation system. The ventilation was actually the key to the whole operation because without proper airflow, the smoke would have filled the building and given us away immediately, which would have ended everything before it even started. Declan figured out that the old ventilation system in the basement was separate from the main building system and vented out through a section of roof that was on the opposite side of the building from where people typically were. With some modifications and a lot of testing, we were able to create an airflow pattern that pulled the smoke out of the basement without it spreading to other floors, though we would later learn that this wasn't quite as foolproof as we thought. The first cook was a nervous affair, with all of us gathered in the basement at 6 in the morning before anyone else arrived, testing the smoker with a small batch of brisket to see if the whole system would actually work. We had exit strategies planned in case something went wrong, explanations prepared for why we might be found in the basement, and a group text chain ready to alert everyone if we needed to shut down quickly. But nothing went wrong, and 6 hours later we were sitting in that basement together, eating some of the best brisket I've ever had, feeling like we had accomplished something that mattered even though we couldn't tell anyone about it. What we called the protein resistance grew organically over the following weeks as word spread quietly among trusted colleagues, and more people wanted to be part of what we were building. We developed systems for everything, encrypted messaging to announce when food was ready, a rotation of who would bring supplies and who would handle the cooking, schedules that ensured the basement was never accessed at times when someone might notice. The secret knocks and coded language probably sound silly in retrospect, but they were part of what made the whole experience feel special, like we were part of something that mattered to all of us. Tamsin from the design team became one of our most dedicated members, surprising everyone because she was someone most people assumed would support Waverly's plant-based initiative given her general progressive politics and environmental consciousness. When I asked her about it, she explained that she supported people's right to choose plant-based diets, but she didn't support forcing those choices on others, and that the basement barbecue was as much about autonomy and community as it was about meat. Her perspective helped me understand that what we were doing wasn't really about rejecting environmentalism or progressive values. It was about rejecting the idea that one person's ideology should be imposed on everyone else. The community that formed in that basement was unlike anything I had experienced in my professional life, a genuine connection among people who might not have otherwise spent much time together. Executives ate alongside interns, designers shared tables with accountants, and the usual office hierarchies melted away in the smoke and the shared experience of doing something together that felt a little bit forbidden. Some of our best creative work actually came out of conversations that happened during those basement gatherings, ideas that crossed departmental boundaries because people who wouldn't normally talk to each other were suddenly spending time together in a relaxed environment. Osgood, one of the building's security guards, figured out what we were doing within the first month, and for a terrifying few hours we thought the whole thing was over before it had really gotten started. But instead of reporting us, he asked if he could join, explaining that the plant-based policy applied to security staff too, and that he had been struggling with it more than most because of his size and metabolic needs. Having Osgood on our side actually made the operation more secure because he could warn us if anyone was heading toward the basement unexpectedly and could help us maintain cover during the times when we were most vulnerable. The operation ran smoothly for about 4 months, longer than any of us had expected when we first started, and during that time the protein resistance became one of the best parts of working at Catalyst Creative. We served hundreds of meals, brought together people from every department, and created a sense of community and shared purpose that the official company culture initiatives had never managed to achieve. Looking back, I think the secrecy was actually part of what made it work so well. The feeling that we were all in on something together created bonds that ordinary workplace socializing couldn't replicate. The beginning of the end came on a Thursday afternoon in late spring, when the weather was warm enough that we had been a little less careful than usual about the timing of our cook. Philippa from HR had been wandering the building looking for a conference room for a private call, and she happened to pass near the stairwell that led to the basement at exactly the wrong moment. She later told me that she caught just a hint of hickory smoke, barely noticeable but distinctive enough that she knew immediately what it was, and she spent the rest of the day trying to figure out where it was coming from. Philippa was in a difficult position because she genuinely liked most of us and didn't want to get anyone in trouble, but she also worked directly for Waverly and had professional obligations she couldn't ignore. She came to me privately that evening and told me that she knew something was going on, and that if she could smell it, eventually Waverly would too, and we should think about how we wanted to handle what was coming. It was a kindness that she warned us, and I've always been grateful to her for giving us time to prepare rather than simply reporting what she suspected to leadership immediately. We had a meeting that night in the basement, our whole core group plus a few others who had become essential to the operation, trying to decide what to do now that discovery seemed inevitable. Some people wanted to shut everything down immediately, remove the equipment, and pretend it had never happened, hoping that without evidence there would be nothing to punish. Others felt that if we were going to be discovered anyway, we might as well own what we had built and make our case for why it mattered, even if that meant facing consequences. In the end, we decided on something in between. We would continue operating, but we would also prepare for the conversation that was coming, thinking through our arguments and our positions so that when the confrontation happened, we would be ready. We weren't naive enough to think that Waverly would be happy about what we had done, but we hoped that if we could explain our perspective and show her what the basement community had meant to people, she might at least understand why it had happened. That hope turned out to be optimistic, but I don't regret the decision to stand behind what we had built rather than abandoning it at the first sign of trouble. The discovery happened on a Tuesday, about a week after Philippa's warning, when Waverly was in the building later than usual for an evening meeting with clients and happened to walk past the same stairwell at a moment when we were in the middle of a cook. The smell that day was stronger than usual because we were doing a larger batch for a celebration someone had requested, and even our ventilation system couldn't completely contain the distinctive aroma of smoking meat. Waverly followed her nose down the stairs, and what she found when she opened the basement door was about 15 of us gathered around the smoker, plates of brisket in hand, looking like we had been caught doing something we weren't supposed to be doing, which of course we had. The moment of discovery was quieter than you might expect. No shouting or immediate accusations, just Waverly standing in the doorway taking in the scene while we all waited to see what would happen next. She looked at the smoker, at the makeshift seating we had arranged, at the people gathered there who represented some of the company's most talented and dedicated employees, and I could see her processing what all of this meant. When she finally spoke, her voice was controlled but clearly angry, and she asked simply whether we understood that we had violated company policy and potentially created liability issues by operating cooking equipment in an unauthorized space. I was the one who responded, partly because I felt responsible as one of the people who had started the whole thing, and partly because no one else seemed ready to speak in that moment. I acknowledged that we had violated the policy and that we understood there might be consequences, but I also tried to explain why we had done it, the community we had built, the connections that had formed, the sense of autonomy that mattered to us. I told her that we weren't trying to disrespect her or reject her values. We just felt that our personal food choices shouldn't be controlled by our employer, and that when that control was imposed, we found a way to maintain our autonomy. Waverly listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she asked whether we thought our desire for barbecue justified deceiving the company and creating potential safety hazards in the building. It was a fair question, and I didn't have a perfect answer for it, because the truth was that we had taken risks and bent rules in ways that weren't entirely defensible no matter how good our intentions were. What I said was that the policy itself had created a situation where people felt they had to choose between compliance and community, and that maybe if the policy had been different, none of this would have been necessary. The aftermath of the discovery was complicated and unfolded over several weeks as Waverly and the leadership team decided how to respond to what they had found. There were meetings, discussions about consequences, debates about whether people should be terminated or disciplined, and throughout it all, those of us who had been involved stuck together and supported each other. What Waverly didn't anticipate, I think, was how many people were involved and how many of them were essential to the company's operations, because punishing everyone would have meant losing a significant portion of the agency's talent. The resolution came when several of us, including some of the agency's top performers, made clear that we were prepared to leave rather than continue working under a policy that we felt was an overreach into our personal lives. We weren't threatening or aggressive about it. We simply explained that the experience had clarified for us what kind of workplace we wanted to be part of, and that if Catalyst Creative couldn't be that place, we would find somewhere that could. The combination of principle and practical reality seemed to land with the leadership team, though not in the way that led to immediate reconciliation. Waverly chose not to reverse the plant-based policy, which was her right as CEO, but she also couldn't afford to lose the talent that was prepared to walk away over the issue. The compromise that emerged was an uncomfortable standoff where the policy technically remained in place, but was understood to be largely unenforceable, creating an awkward situation that satisfied no one and solved nothing. Within 3 months, the tension had become untenable, and the exodus began, not all at once like some of the other stories I've shared, but gradually as people found opportunities elsewhere and decided to take them. The group that had formed in the basement stayed connected even as we scattered to different companies and opportunities, and eventually several of us decided to start something of our own. We called it Ember and Oak Creative, a name that referenced our shared history without being too obvious about it, and we built it on principles that reflected what we had learned from the whole experience. Our workplace policy is simple. We treat people like adults who can make their own decisions about things that don't affect their work, and we trust that when people feel respected, they'll do their best work. Catalyst Creative struggled after the talent drain, losing several major clients who had relationships with the people who left rather than with the agency itself. I don't know what eventually happened to Waverly, whether she stayed or moved on, but I hope she learned something from the experience even if it wasn't the lesson she expected to teach. The point was never that meat is better than plant-based food or that environmental concerns don't matter. It was that respect and autonomy matter too, and that leaders who forget that often end up leading empty rooms. The lesson I took from this whole experience is about the difference between leadership and control, and why the first one builds loyalty, while the second one destroys it. True leadership is about inspiring people to want to follow you, creating environments where people can do their best work, and trusting your team to make good decisions about their own lives. Control is about imposing your preferences on others because you have the power to do so, and while it might create compliance in the short term, it never creates the kind of commitment that great organizations are built on. I also learned something about community and how it forms in unexpected places when people share experiences that feel meaningful, even if those experiences are as simple as eating good food together in a basement. The bonds that formed during those months of the protein resistance are still some of the strongest professional relationships I have, and several of those people are now my partners at Ember and Oak. Sometimes the best things that happen in your career come from the strangest situations, and the willingness to take risks with people you trust can lead to outcomes you never could have planned. For anyone watching this who feels like their workplace is imposing rules that don't make sense and don't respect their autonomy, I hope this story offers some encouragement that you're not alone and that there are always options. Sometimes those options involve finding creative solutions within constraints, sometimes they involve having honest conversations about what's not working, and sometimes they involve leaving to find or build something better. Whatever path you choose, remember that your dignity and your right to make decisions about your own life matter, and that workplaces that don't respect those things don't deserve your best efforts. Ember and Oak is doing well now, growing steadily and building a reputation for creative excellence and a culture that people actually want to be part of. We still do barbecues, though now they're above ground and official, and they remain one of the ways we build community and connection among our team. Every time I smell hickory smoke, I think about that basement and the unlikely journey that brought me from secret cookouts to running my own agency with people I trust and respect. Thank you for being here and for listening to this story. It's one of my favorites to tell because it reminds me that sometimes the strangest experiences turn out to be the most valuable. If you enjoyed this, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and if you haven't subscribed yet, I'd be grateful if you'd consider it. Take care of yourselves, stand up for what matters to you, and I'll see you in the next one.